Ever been fascinated by how some movements just seem to catch fire and spread like crazy, while others, well, with seemingly the same spark, barely flicker?
Yeah, it's something, isn't it?
Today, we're going to try and dissect that very question. We're taking a deep dive into the life cycle of movements, specifically in a religious context, to see if we can spot some underlying patterns.
Okay, let's unpack this because we're looking at a really interesting framework today.
It is fascinating, the idea that even though every movement feels unique, there might be these surprisingly consistent phases they, well, tend to go through.
Exactly. And we've drawn on the work of several experienced folks, Don Dent, Nick Ripken, Mark Stevens, Neil Mims practitioners and trainers who've seen these patterns play out.
Right, and they've sort of synthesized them into what we can talk about as 4 distinct stages.
Think of it as getting a kind of behind-the-scenes look at how these things often unfold.
We'll be exploring these 4 stages, starting from that initial planting, the unreached phase, they call it, right through to becoming maybe a more established institutional presence.
And just to be clear, the goal here isn't really to judge any stage, like saying one is better.
No, not at all.
It's more about understanding the dynamics, right?
Yeah.
The strengths and maybe the potential pitfalls in each phase.
And how the shifts between them happen. That's key.
And why is this useful? Well, by recognizing these phases, you get a kind of analytical lens. You can start to make sense of what you're seeing in a movement, maybe even anticipate some challenges down the road.
And navigate those transitions maybe a bit more effectively. Okay, so let's dive into stage 1 then, the unreached phase.
Okay.
So picture a community, maybe a whole people group, where there's very little existing Christian presence, maybe just a handful of believers, perhaps none at all.
Right. This is the starting line. Often it's outsiders, external groups, who initiate the mission work here.
And what's crucial at this point?
Simplicity. It seems absolutely vital that the forms, the methods, how the message is shared, how community happens, it all needs to be simple.
Why simple?
Well, if it's too complex, needs too many outside resources, or relies too heavily on, say, professional expertise in the get-go, it's just unlikely a truly organic local movement will take root.
So think basic ways of sharing core ideas, forming small groups.
Exactly. Very informal gatherings. And the growth you see initially, the number of actual Christians, it's usually pretty gradual, almost seed-like, as you said.
Incremental.
Yes, incremental. A lot of that initial outreach, those very first little faith communities, they're often sparked by these external folks.
And church at this stage looks very different, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. It's often incredibly informal. People meeting in a living room, maybe gathering under a big tree, wherever they can find space to connect and share.
Now, you mentioned something critical earlier about empowerment.
Ah, yes. The priesthood of every believer. This is maybe the critical element to grasp in stage 1.
Explain that a bit more.
It's the fundamental idea that every single person who embraces the faith isn't just a passive receiver. They are empowered, they are equipped to actually minister, to share their beliefs directly with others.
Not just relying on the initial outside workers.
Precisely. If that understanding doesn't take hold, if it doesn't become a lived reality pretty early on, the whole effort can just remain perpetually dependent on outsiders.
Like needing someone else to keep planting the seeds for you.
You got it. It's that whole teaching people to fish analogy. And leadership development reflects this too.
How so?
It tends to be very grassroots. It's about mentoring relationships. It's learning by doing right there, those small local gatherings.
Yeah.
More experienced believers guiding the newer ones. Very informal.
Okay. So this unreached phase, if it really prioritizes empowering new believers right from the start,
Yes, laying that foundation of shared ownership using simple, reproducible methods.
then it has the potential to ignite something much bigger.
Absolutely. That's when you can see the beginnings of what people call a church planting movement, that rapid organic multiplication of local churches planting other local churches.
Which leads us perfectly into stage 2, the movement phase.
Right. This is where things really start picking up speed.
You see real momentum. The growth, both in new believers and new churches multiplying it, becomes driven primarily by the local believers now.
Yes. They've caught the vision for reaching their own people, their own communities.
And that acceleration in numbers we talked about.
That's that priesthood of every believer concept really taking flight. Because they feel empowered, they have simple ways to share, they're doing it naturally within their own networks.
And new faith communities are just springing up.
Organically, yes. And those churches.
Yeah.
Still typically very informal, predominantly meeting in homes.
And the key word here is
Multiplication. It's not just about one church getting bigger. It's about new, autonomous groups constantly emerging.
So you might see one house church become 5, then 20, fairly quickly.
Exactly. And the local believers, the indigenous believers, they're now initiating pretty much all aspects of ministry themselves.
Like evangelism, baptisms.
Starting new groups, the leadership that emerges naturally within those groups. They're doing it without waiting for outside permission or, resources.
And that clergy-laity divide.
It's just not really a strong feature at this stage. Everyone's involved. And interestingly, a movement can actually stay in this really dynamic reproductive phase for quite a long time.
But inevitably, perhaps, as these movements keep expanding, things start to shift again.
Often, yes. A natural inclination towards a bit more structure starts to emerge.
Which brings us to stage 3, the formalizing phase, sometimes called the established phase.
Right. So you've got this incredible momentum from stage 2. Local ownership is high. But as the sheer number of believers keeps growing fast, people often feel a need for, more standardization.
Standardization in what way?
Things like, how do we recognize a church? How do we develop leaders more intentionally now that there are so many? Maybe some consistency in teaching across the network.
So leadership development starts changing from just informal mentoring.
It often becomes more intentional, sometimes more structured. You might see early forms of what's called theological education by extension, basically, bringing training into local context in a more organized way.
Instead of having to send people away somewhere.
Exactly, making it accessible. And you also start to see some physical changes.
Like buildings.
Sometimes, yes. Alongside those ongoing home meetings, some communities might begin to put up dedicated church buildings. Maybe simple at first, but signifying something more permanent.
A visible presence. And they can hold more people, presumably.
Often, yes. And leadership development itself starts to formalize more, too.
How does that look?
You might see dedicated institutions starting to pop up, small Bible training centers, maybe even the beginnings of seminaries.
Aimed at training larger numbers more systematically.
Right. And this often leads to things like certificates, diplomas, credentials, basically, to recognize that training.
And you start seeing specific leaders emerge with particular gifts.
Yes, individuals who are maybe particularly skilled in preaching or teaching or administration, they become more prominent.
Okay, but here's where a potential tension creeps in, right?
Yes, this is really interesting because this formalization, while it seems positive, maybe even necessary for scale, it can unintentionally widen that gap again.
The clergy-laity divide we talked about disappearing in stage 2?
Exactly. Those regular disciples, the everyday believers who were so crucial in stage 2, if they don't have access to this new formal training or the credentials.
They might start to feel less equipped, less authorized to actually do ministry.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the pastors and the trained leaders genuinely want everyone involved, the emphasis on professionalized leadership can sometimes unintentionally intimidate others.
So that powerful idea of every member a minister.
It can start to fade, unfortunately.
Yeah.
People might begin deferring more to the experts.
Which leads us then to stage 4, the institutional phase.
The mature stage, you could say.
So what characterizes this phase?
Well, you typically have a large, well-established body of believers. Churches are generally accepted, maybe even respected, in the wider society.
And most gatherings are happening in dedicated buildings now.
Predominantly, yes. Purpose-built structures are the norm. Home-based churches might even seem a bit unusual or, alternative at this point.
And what about growth?
Here's a key point. While the overall number of adherents might still be growing, maybe due to birth rates within the Christian community,
Right.
It's not uncommon for the movement to hit a plateau in terms of the rate of new conversions from outside. That rapid exponential growth from earlier stages, it often slows down significantly.
And leadership development.
Highly institutionalized. Seminaries, Bible colleges, they become the main, often expected pathway for training leaders.
Credentials become really important.
Often an unspoken requirement for significant roles, And you tend to see more full-time or part-time professional leaders.
And less visible lay leadership, less spontaneous emergence of leaders.
Generally, yes. And sadly, that concept of the priesthood of the believer, its lived reality, often wanes quite drastically here.
How does that show up?
Believers are much more likely to see their role as inviting friends to church.
Where the professionals will take over.
Kind of.
Yeah.
They expect the pastors, the staff, to handle the primary spiritual guidance and, leading people to faith, rather than feeling personally equipped and responsible for that themselves.
And you also see more big institutions.
Definitely. Seminaries, publishing houses, denominational offices, mission agencies, they become major players, have a big impact. But it's a very different kind of impact compared to that grassroots explosion in stage 2.
Okay, so understanding these 4 stages, it really shines a light on some common tensions, doesn't it? Especially when people from different stages interact.
Oh, absolutely. Think about someone, say, from a deep stage 4 background, trying to start work in a stage 1 context.
Where there's almost nothing established yet.
Right. What often happens?
Well, I guess they might unintentionally try to replicate what they know the stage 4 stuff. Buildings, programs.
Exactly. We heard this incredible story about a mission group in sub-Saharan Africa. They looked back and realized it was taking them, on average, 22 years.
Well, 22 years.
To do what?
To establish what they considered a proper, functioning stage 4 style church, often focusing on the building first, the complex programs, before really building that core community of empowered local believers.
Wow. That's a huge mismatch.
A powerful illustration, isn't it? And you see similar things maybe with Korean missionaries coming from very strong institutional churches.
Feeling pressure maybe to build big churches quickly.
Right. Establish complex structures really fast in new fields, which might not fit the early stages at all.
And leadership development across stages.
Yeah.
That creates friction too.
Definitely. There was this anecdote about local partners. They'd had solid training in simple, reproducible stage 1 and 2 methods for like a year.
But when it came time to actually choose new leaders for their young movement, they immediately snapped back to stage 4 thinking.
Looking for the highly trained, super mature person.
Exactly. Even though in a brand new movement, those people barely exist yet. They were overlooking the potential leaders emerging naturally.
And the reverse can be damaging too, right? Taking stage 1 or 2 believers and exposing them too soon to stage 4 stuff.
Oh, hugely detrimental. Imagine leaders from a tiny new mountain church visiting huge, established city churches.
Big buildings, complex programs.
Right. They go back home feeling pressured to implement all that complexity in their little fledgling group. It can just crush the momentum.
It's like trying to put a toddler in university.
That's a great way to put it. They're just not ready, and it's incredibly discouraging.
And sadly, people in stage 4 can sometimes look at stage 2 movements and, well, misunderstand them.
Or be unintentionally critical, yeah. Dismissing vibrant house church networks because they're not real churches, in their view.
Or insisting on credentials for leaders that just aren't feasible or even relevant yet.
It really shows that difference in perspective.
Yeah.
When your frame of reference is stage 4 norms, buildings, formal training, budgets,
then the simpler, maybe messier reality of stage 2 can look inadequate.
Or chaotic, yeah. And you can even undermine it unintentionally, like offering to fully fund bivocational pastors in a stage 2 setting.
Which sounds generous, but
it creates dependency. It potentially kills the self-sufficiency and the tent-maker spirit that's so vital in that phase.
Okay, this is making so much sense. We actually came across a really fascinating historical example of what looks like a powerful stage 2 movement.
Oh, yeah. Where was that?
Right here in the U.S., actually. The Baptist movement on the American frontier, roughly 1790 to 1810.
Ah, interesting. What did that look like?
Well, according to historian Robert Baker, they had this remarkably simple gospel message. And crucially, they relied heavily on bivocational preachers.
Tent maker.
Exactly, guys who lived and worked just like the people they were reaching. And their church structure was very decentralized. Apparently, it fit the whole frontier spirit perfectly.
And that lack of a rigid clergy-laity divide was key there too, I bet.
Baker highlights that. He said the main distinction for these preachers was just this compelling, urgent desire to share the gospel, not necessarily loads of formal training or a different status.
It's empowered believers stepping up.
Right. And the result, incredible growth, almost a 10-fold increase in believers and churches in just about 20 years.
Wow, 10-fold.
And the powerful takeaway is this isn't just some historical one-off. This pattern, stage 2 expansion, simple methods, empowered everyday believers.
It's repeated itself all over the world throughout history.
And maybe the most encouraging part for people in more established settings
is that denominations may be feeling stuck in a stage 4 plateau. They can often find new life by intentionally going back to stage 2 principles.
Rediscovering that simplicity. Actively empowering every believer again.
Exactly. Seeing everyone as vital in sharing faith, not just inviting people to a building. So the really compelling question this whole framework leaves us with is, well, why not today? Why not in your own context, whatever that looks like?
Yeah, it's a good question. Ultimately, this framework, these 4 stages, it's just a really valuable lens, isn't it?
It helps you understand the progression, the potential challenges.
And by recognizing where a movement, or maybe even an organization, currently sits on this spectrum.
You can be more aware of what's appropriate, what kinds of expectations make sense.
And maybe, just as importantly, avoid imposing things that might actually hinder growth, stifle that vitality.
Absolutely. We'd really encourage you, the listener, to maybe take some time, reflect on these 4 stages.
Yeah, think about movements or organizations you know. Do these stages offer any insights? Could be religious, could be secular even.
And maybe the final thought to leave you chewing on is this. What if the key to new growth, to that renewed sense of purpose we all look for, what if it actually lies in rediscovering some of that simplicity?
And that widespread empowerment that really characterized those earlier stages.
Something to think about.